Hey guys, tonight we wander into a world where silk rustles like whispers and the flicker of candlelight hides 1,000 secrets. You're stepping into medieval Europe, a place that feels both hauntingly familiar and strangely alien. The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with last night's rain, and the air tastes of smoke, iron, and something faintly sweet, like honey left too long on a table. You glance up, and there's a noblewoman gliding past, her gown sweeping the dirt as if she doesn't notice the mud at all. You probably won't survive this place unless you learn fast who truly holds the power, because in this world, influence isn't always written in law. It's stitched into velvet and whispered in bedchambers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing our little global village light up with voices from every corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the hall of a grand estate, the kind where the tapestries on the walls cost more than most peasants would earn in a lifetime. At the center sits a noblewoman, not the lady of the manor, but someone far more complicated, his mistress. She wears a pearl necklace so radiant you can't help but think it's worth more than a small farm, maybe even a whole village. She isn't ashamed or quiet. In fact, she laughs when she tells you, his wife manages the estate, but I manage him. It's not just a boast. It's a simple truth in a society where political marriages often lack warmth or passion. Mistresses weren't merely companions. They were confidants, sometimes wielding as much cultural influence as queens themselves. Historians still argue whether these women were independent power players or merely pawns in a larger game. What's certain is that their presence could shape both politics and fashion. You hear about Yesel, mistress to King Charles II of France. Not only did she influence court decisions, but her low-cut gown sparked whispers across the continent. The church, naturally, called her scandalous. Yet noble women everywhere began copying her style. One woman's neckline became the talk of Europe. You glance at the noblewoman in front of you. She leans forward, her voice dropping, confiding in you like an old friend. Queens wear crowns, but I have something better. His secrets. There's a glint in her eyes, both proud and wary. Because being a mistress wasn't just silk and candlelight. It was a high-stakes game. If her patron died, remarried, or simply grew tired of her, she could be cast out overnight. Richer than most, yes, but legally vulnerable. That's why many mistresses insisted on gifts of land or houses, anchors in a world built on shifting sand. One story you overhear is of a former mistress who secured a vineyard as part of her farewell. She retired comfortably, sipping wine that bore her name. Others weren't so fortunate. Many slipped into obscurity, erased from records once they lost their protector's favor. Their portraits removed from galleries, their names forgotten in dusty archives. You leave the hall and wander through the courtyard, past marble statues that seem to watch you with lifeless eyes. A young servant girl carrying water glances at you and whispers something to her friend. The gossip moves faster than the wind. It reminds you that in the medieval world, reputation was everything, especially for women. A single rumor could alter the course of a life. As the sun dips lower, you find yourself in a smaller chamber, walls lined with polished wood. A woman sits by the window, her silhouette framed by the last light of day. She isn't dressed like a noble, but her presence is commanding. The true power of a woman, she says, is knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. You realize you're not just learning about mistresses and nobles tonight. You're peering into a world where influence is subtle, almost invisible, but no less real. Remember that detail about Yessel's fashion trend? Well, here's a fringe fact you might not expect. Some churches were so alarmed by plunging necklines that they issued official decrees against excessive display of the bosom. Can you imagine priests taking time out of sermons about salvation just to complain about silk dresses? And yet, they did. As night falls, you notice a tension in the air. For every woman like Yesel who climbed the ladder of influence, there were countless others who tried and failed. Historians still debate whether mistresses were symbols of female empowerment or cautionary tales of dependence on male favor. You suspect the truth lies somewhere in between. You step back outside into the cool evening air. The stars are just beginning to show, pinpricks of light against a darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the faint notes of a lute. Maybe a court poet is composing verses about a woman like Yesel right now, turning whispers into immortal lines. As you walk through the narrow paths of the manor garden, you can't shake the feeling that you've seen just one layer of a much deeper tapestry. Power here isn't loud. It's soft, subtle, like the scent of perfume lingering in a room long after its owner has left. And as you follow the path out of the estate, you wonder, how many stories like this have been lost, buried under centuries of dust and silence? The evening deepens as you leave the manor's warmth and step into the cool night air, where shadows stretch like gossip across cobblestone streets. You wander past flickering torches and a market square emptied of daytime chaos. Here, power shifts from pearls and silk to whispered rumors, and women who forge their own paths far from noble courts. You meet Tilda, a healer living on the edge of town. She's nothing like the polished mistress you just saw. Her world smells of damp earth, dried herbs, and smoke from a single crooked chimney. Tilda's hut stands slightly apart from the rest of the village, as if the town itself doesn't quite know what to do with her. You duck under the low doorframe and enter a room that feels both cluttered and sacred. Bundles of rosemary hang from the rafters. Jars filled with strange roots line the shelves, and the air is heavy with the metallic tang of freshly cut yarrow. Tilda rinses dirt from her hands in a copper bowl, her movements precise, unhurried. "I like silence," she says, almost as if you'd asked. "Lovers make too much noise." You chuckle, but she's not joking. Tilda lives outside the expectations of her time. She's had companions, men, and women, but refuses to be owned. And for that, the village calls her names: witch, temptress, stranger. The church views her knowledge of the human body as suspicious, almost threatening. She shrugs when you bring it up. The men don't like what they can't control. Let them talk. And talk they do. In the medieval world, gossip is a form of currency, traded with more vigor than silver coins. Historians still argue whether women like Tilda were rebels or simply survivors carving out autonomy wherever they could. The line between respect and fear was thin, and a woman who stepped out of her prescribed role was often accused of sorcery, or worse. You recall reading records where women stood trial not for crimes, but for behavior considered unfeminine. Swearing too much? Suspicious? Walking alone at night? Definitely suspect. One case in Lübeck involved a woman dragged before a council for the scandalous act of wearing trousers under her dress. Her defense? It's warmer. Practicality, apparently, was no excuse. You glance at Tilda's clothing, plain wool, patched and faded. Nothing about her screams danger, yet the quiet confidence in her eyes is enough to unsettle the villagers. It makes you think of countless unnamed women who never fit neatly into the boxes society built for them. Widows who chose not to remarry. Weavers who preferred their own company. Midwives who knew too much about life and death. These women slipped through cracks, and for that, they were marked as different. Here's your quirky fact of the night. In late medieval Germany, certain towns allowed women to form their own guilds. Imagine it, groups of widowed or single women running brewing operations, voting on business matters, and enforcing quality control with what one record called delightful ferocity. A brewing guild known as the Hop Sisters even dominated their local beer market for decades, raising prices when the men complained. A quiet act of defiance? Absolutely. As you leave Tilda's hut, the village unfolds like a tapestry of contradictions. A merchant's wife shouts orders at her servant in the street, while a young girl passes by with a bundle of herbs tucked under her arm. Two older women sit on a stoop, their conversation quick and sharp, dissecting the behavior of a neighbor who, apparently, smiles too often. You can almost feel the weight of their judgments pressing against the night air. Women in the Middle Ages were everything and nothing all at once. Saints and sinners, mothers and witches, silent shadows and outspoken rebels. Their lives were shaped by rules, but rarely defined by them. Some climbed quietly within the systems that confined them, like the mistress with her pearls and influence. Others, like Tilda, walked outside those walls altogether, unbothered by expectations. And then there were those who tried to build something new, like the Hop Sisters, brewing and thriving in a world that underestimated them. Historians still debate whether these stories are exceptions or proof that medieval society was less rigid than we assume. Were these women merely outliers, or were they living examples of the cracks that always existed in the social order? You suspect the answer lies somewhere between the gossip and the guilds. As twilight bleeds into night, you catch one last glimpse of Tilda at her doorway, the firelight painting her face in gold and shadow. She nods once, a silent farewell, and turns back to her work. You walk on, the street glowing faintly under a rising moon. The whispers of the village fade behind you, but their stories linger, tugging at the corners of your mind like threads waiting to be woven into something bigger. The road ahead dips into a marketplace that never truly sleeps. Lanterns sway in the breeze, and bolts of fabric spill across a merchant's table like liquid color. Next, you'll run your hands over silks and furs that do more than keep people warm. They seduce, conceal, and reveal. Because in a world where desire is whispered about, even clothing becomes part of the game. You step into the marketplace, and the noise hits you like a wave. Bells clang, merchants shout over one another, and the air is thick with the scent of spices, sweat, and roasted chestnuts. But your attention is drawn to something quieter, something that doesn't need to shout. A bolt of deep crimson velvet stretched across a merchant's table, smooth and rich enough to make you forget your own name. You run your fingers along its surface, and it feels almost alive, humming with the kind of silent promise that makes people lean closer without even realizing it. Clothing in the Middle Ages was never just about warmth or modesty. It was a language, a seduction, an armor. Each stitch whispered messages that couldn't be said aloud, especially when the church was busy lecturing everyone about modesty and restraint. When words were forbidden, fabric spoke. A gown that clung just so, a sleeve that slipped off the wrist in motion, or a veil that revealed just enough golden hair to make the priest scowl. These were the subtleties that kept desire alive under layers of wool and linen. The merchant, a man with hands stained from dyes and a grin as wide as the street, waves you over. He lifts a roll of fine Italian silk, dyed with crushed lapis lazuli, the blue shimmering like water, caught in sunlight. For noble ladies, he says, but the way he says it, you know this fabric is less about covering and more about revealing. Thin as a breath, it shimmers and clings. You imagine a noble woman wearing this, layers of translucent gauze creating the illusion of modesty while hinting at the shape of the body beneath. Historians still argue whether the medieval obsession with sumptuary laws, those rigid rules dictating who could wear what, was about morality or just about keeping the rich visibly richer than everyone else. The rules were absurd. Commoners couldn't wear velvet. Prostitutes were forced to wear specific colors. No woman could wear pearls unless her husband earned enough to satisfy the tax collectors. And no one, not even queens, was supposed to show too much flesh. Naturally, everyone ignored these laws or found clever ways around them. A woman passes you in the crowd, her gown hugging her hips with an intentional boldness. The laces along her back are tight, and the neckline dips just low enough to spark whispers. Her head is covered, of course, because modesty, but her golden curls peek out deliberately, catching the light like a secret dare. You can almost hear the theologians groaning in their manuscripts. Hair itself, believe it or not, was considered wildly erotic. Entire treatises were written about its power to tempt men into sin. St. Paul himself declared that women should keep their hair covered, lest their very presence cause spiritual downfall. But behind closed doors, hair was brushed, perfumed, unbound, and displayed for lovers like a private, forbidden show. And then there are the shoes. Oh, the shoes. In the late Middle Ages, men wore poulaines, those long, absurdly pointed shoes that extended several inches past the toes, curving upward like a sly wink. The church hated them with a fiery passion. They were called sinful, prideful, and, in one memorable sermon, obscene instruments of vanity. The logic? The longer the shoe, the wealthier, and therefore more morally suspect, the man. In some towns, the length of a shoe's point was even rumored to correspond to the size of another protrusion. You try not to laugh, but let's be honest. The comparison was too tempting, even for medieval minds. Women had their own arsenal of fashion tricks. Fitted bodices, side lacing that cinched the waist, sleeves that were intentionally tight to show off the slenderness of the arms. Even the scent of clothing mattered. Garments were often infused with herbs, rose, lavender, frankincense. Not because they lacked soap, well, that too, but because fragrance became a silent signal. I'm clean. I'm wealthy. I'm desirable. Here's your quirky fact of the night. Some medieval men wore codpieces, little padded pouches at the front of their hose, originally for modesty, but later as outright symbols of virility. Early on, they were functional, but by the 15th century, they became works of art, embroidered, stuffed, sometimes shaped into literal animal heads or flowers. One codpiece reportedly had a tiny dagger sewn to it, presumably to warn other men away, or maybe just as an ill-conceived attempt at multitasking. Historians still debate whether the codpiece was more about sexual bravado or social status. The answer, as always, is probably both. Fashion wasn't just about attraction. It was also political. During the 100 Years' War, English women were forbidden from wearing French styles, as if the wrong cut of fabric could betray the kingdom. To wear a gown with the wrong sleeve or hemline was a quiet act of rebellion, or, depending on who caught you, treason. You pause by a tailor shop and admire a gown in the window. Green velvet, laced up the front, with slits in the sleeves that let the linen underdress puff out like clouds. It's sensual without being crass, expensive without being gaudy. You can picture a noblewoman at court wearing this, careful not to spill her wine as she smiles, just enough, at her rival's husband. Fashion in this world isn't frivolous, it's strategy. It's how you win without ever drawing a sword. Historians still argue whether these elaborate garments liberated people by allowing self-expression or simply wrapped social expectations in prettier fabric. Did a woman feel empowered by choosing a gown that hinted at her shoulders? Or was she simply playing by the rules of a game designed to objectify her? You suspect both are true. Medieval society excelled at contradiction, condemning desire while dressing it up in velvet. As you leave the market, the wind catches the edge of your cloak, and you feel the subtle weight of the fabric. A man glances at you, not too long, but long enough to remind you that every thread you wear tells a story. Whether you like it or not, you're part of the game now. Dressed or undressed, your body carries its own language. The road narrows as the market noise fades and night falls heavier around you. Ahead, a village slumbers uneasily, shutters closed, candles snuffed. Somewhere beyond the reach of torchlight, darker forces stir. Next, you'll step into a dreamscape where desire wears the face of a demon, where medieval minds blamed the night's terrors on creatures with wings, claws, and far too much interest in your bed. The village is quiet now, smothered in darkness so thick you can almost feel it pressing against your skin. Gone is the market's bustle, replaced by a silence that feels deliberate, as if the world itself is holding its breath. Even the dogs don't bark. A single candle flickers in a window before it's snuffed out, leaving only the glow of the moon on the cobblestones. You step carefully, aware that in this part of the medieval world, fear after sundown isn't about thieves or wolves. It's about something far stranger, something that slips into dreams and leaves you trembling by morning. You hear the first whisper of it from a shepherd leaning against a fence, his knuckles white as he clutches a wooden cross. "It came through the wall," he mutters, eyes darting. Looked like her husband, but with eyes that burned. He's talking about his neighbor, a woman who hasn't left her bed for days. She won't speak to anyone, just stares at the ceiling with the kind of hollow gaze that makes you wonder what she saw in the dark. In the medieval mind, unexplained lust especially the kind that showed up uninvited in dreams, had to come from outside. It couldn't possibly be the self. No, it had to be the work of demons. And thus, the infamous incubus and succubus were born. These shape-shifting spirits were said to creep into your bed while you slept. The incubus, male, preyed on women, while the succubus, female, haunted men. Although, to be honest, medieval writers weren't exactly clear on the rules. Some demons didn't care about gender. Others switched forms, appearing as lost lovers or dead spouses to lower their victims' defenses before taking what they wanted. Historians still argue whether these accounts were genuine attempts to explain sleep paralysis, trauma, or just a convenient way to blame sin on something with horns and wings. You flip through a battered copy of the Malleus Maleficarum, that infamous 15th century witch-hunting manual, and find entire chapters obsessing over demonic lust. The authors, two particularly zealous inquisitors, claimed demons stole seed from sleeping men to impregnate women, a kind of infernal reproductive system. They also blamed nocturnal emissions, untraceable pregnancies, and even same-sex encounters on these night visitors. Totally scientific, you think wryly, as you read about demons acting like grotesque couriers of desire. The fear was real, though. If you woke up flushed or sweating, people believed you might have invited a demon without realizing it. For women, especially, this was a double bind. Admit to being aroused, and you risked accusations of consorting with the devil. Deny it, and someone else might decide you were lying, and that was worse. In convents, nuns whispered of devils with warm breath who kissed their necks while they recited psalms. Others claimed to see angelic men with dark eyes and soft hands, making their chastity vows feel less like virtue and more like torment. You picture those lonely convent halls, the silence broken only by footsteps and whispered prayers, and it's easy to see how suppressed longing might take the shape of a nightmare. But not everyone feared the demons. Some stories sound suspiciously like, well, romantic fan fiction. One woman in Milan was tried for claiming she willingly took a demon lover who appeared as a dark-haired knight. She described his voice, his hands, the way he moved like smoke. The court condemned her as a heretic, of course. But you can't help thinking she just found a dangerously clever way to talk about her desires in a world where women weren't supposed to have any. The church leaned into the terror. Priests gave fiery sermons, warning that masturbation would summon succubi, that dreams of intimacy were invitations to possession, and that pleasure for its own sake was practically a handshake with Satan. One account describes a nun who woke with scratches on her thighs and claimed nightly ravishment. The priest didn't ask if she was ill or lonely. He simply declared her marked by hell. And here's your quirky fact of the night. Not everyone blamed demons. Some medieval medical texts, especially those influenced by Islamic scholars, argued that erotic dreams were caused by vapors rising from the stomach to the brain during sleep. The solution? Better food, fewer onions, maybe even a mild laxative. In a way, that's more rational than the demon theory, and arguably better advice for digestion. Scholars still debate whether these tales of incubus and succubus were metaphors for repressed sexuality, explanations for trauma, or simply vivid storytelling passed from pulpit to hearth. Some argue they were cultural coping mechanisms, ways to rationalize the body's unpredictable urges. Others think the tales were performative, crafted to entertain or terrify audiences who loved a good scandal. Whatever the case, the line between fear and fascination was razor thin. Even monks, supposedly immune to earthly desires, scribbled images of winged women in the margins of their prayer books. Drawings that look less like warnings and more like longing. You climb a narrow staircase into a dusty attic and find an old manuscript left open on a table. In the margin, a monk has drawn a woman with wings kneeling on a man's chest. The lines are uneven, the ink faded, but the tenderness in the drawing is unmistakable. Above it, in careful Latin script, someone has written Domina Somniorum, Lady of Dreams. It doesn't feel like fear. It feels like yearning. You step back outside, the air cool against your face, and realize that in a world where desire was demonized, people didn't stop wanting. They just gave their hunger names, succubus, incubus, and pretended the problem came from beyond the walls. You walk down the road, past a shrine where a candle burns low, and wonder who will dream of whom tonight, and what stories they'll tell come morning. The path ahead is dark, but you sense the narrative shifting. Next, you'll descend into the cramped, herb-scented chambers of medieval medicine, where the so-called experts tried and failed to make sense of sex. It's time to meet the physicians, philosophers, and occasional lunatics who turned desire into diagrams and gave the body explanations that are equal parts brilliant and bizarre. You step into a cramped stone chamber that smells of dried herbs, burned parchment, and something sour, possibly regret. A single narrow window lets in a shaft of dusty light, illuminating a heavy wooden table cluttered with quills, ink pots, and a book so large it looks like it might weigh as much as a sheep. Its vellum pages are smudged with fingerprints and strange stains, the kind you'd rather not ask about. Welcome to the world of medieval medicine, where sex, science, and superstition shared the same lumpy, uncomfortable bed. The book in front of you bears a title that translates roughly as The Secrets of Women. It sounds poetic, mysterious even, until you start reading. Within a few pages, it's clear this is less about understanding and more about controlling the female body. According to the text, conception only occurs if a woman experiences pleasure, specifically, if she orgasms. Yes, you read that correctly. Medieval medical wisdom insisted that female pleasure wasn't just natural, it was essential for pregnancy. It almost sounds progressive until you realize what that meant. If a woman claimed rape but became pregnant, the pregnancy was considered proof that she must have enjoyed it. It's a nightmare logic that turned victimhood into evidence against the victim. Historians still argue whether this belief came from a mistranslation of ancient texts or a convenient way for patriarchal systems to silence women. Much of it can be traced back to Galen, the ancient physician, and his belief that male and female bodies were basically the same structure turned inside out. In Galen's model, men were hotter and drier, while women were colder and wetter, which, according to him, made them less stable, more emotional, and occasionally leaky. Male testicles became ovaries, the penis became the vagina. It was all just a matter of heat and orientation. Science. You flip to an anatomical drawing in the book, and it's almost comically inaccurate. Instead of nerves or detailed reproductive systems, you find vague tunnels and mysterious chambers, as though the artist had never actually seen a woman's anatomy. One caption declares that the uterus has 7 compartments, 3 for boys, 3 for girls, and 1 for monsters. Yes, apparently, there was a special chamber for producing demons, changelings, or freakish offspring, depending on the alignment of the stars and, quite possibly, how much garlic the mother had eaten. The theory behind these ideas wasn't entirely random. Medieval physicians believed the body was ruled by the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Your temperament, health, and even libido depended on keeping these fluids in balance. Too much blood, you were passionate and rash. Too much black bile, you sank into melancholy, and probably celibacy. Sexual desire, they claimed, was caused by excess heat, which is why women, with their supposedly moist interiors, were thought to have higher sexual appetites than men. Yes, that's right. According to this theory, women were the lustier gender. This belief led to some bizarre prescriptions. Certain texts actually recommended female masturbation as a medical treatment. "Better to spill than to swell," wrote one monk physician, as if he were writing an advertisement for an herbal supplement. It's almost progressive, except, of course, when society used the same logic to brand women as dangerously lustful or prone to sin. A woman who expressed desire too openly was seen as unnatural, even demonic. The medical advice to relieve pressure clashed violently with the church's demand for chastity. Men didn't have it much easier. While male sexuality was celebrated as a duty, especially for producing heirs, it was also viewed with suspicion when expressed outside of marriage. Nocturnal emissions were labeled as pollutions, with some doctors claiming that each occurrence weakened the heart or clouded the mind. A terrified young scholar in Paris once confessed to experiencing these pollutions 3 times a week and was told to fast, pray, and sleep on hard wooden boards until the devil left his loins. Imagine being punished for something you didn't even do while awake. And here's your quirky fact of the night. One medieval medical test to determine a woman's virginity involved examining her urine, observing her walk, and, wait for it, seeing if she laughed too easily. Virgins, the text claimed, walked upright, laughed modestly, and kept their eyes down. If she laughed loudly or met your gaze directly, clearly she was no virgin. You can't make this up. As you skim further, you find recipes for medieval aphrodisiacs, many of which sound more like witch's brews than romance enhancers. A popular potion included roasted ants, powdered vulture liver, and goat testicles mixed with wine. One particularly effective recipe promised to inflame the loins and soften the heart, though its side effects probably included food poisoning or death. Another tip involved rubbing nettle oil on your thighs or sleeping with an apple under your pillow, then eating it in the morning to absorb dreams of love. You wonder how many people fell for these tricks or died trying. Midwives, as it turns out, were far more knowledgeable about reproductive health than the physicians of their time. They had practical, experience-based understanding of birth, menstruation, and female anatomy, but their wisdom was rarely written down. When it was often attributed to male scholars who overheard them. Historians still debate how much of what we call medieval medicine was actually folk wisdom stolen from women who knew far more than they were given credit for. Despite the absurdities, these texts give you a fascinating glimpse into a world desperate to explain the mysteries of the body. When they didn't understand something, they filled the gaps with myth, metaphor, and just enough Latin to make it sound legitimate. You close the book, your head spinning with a mixture of humor and horror. The ink stains on the pages look almost like fingerprints reaching across centuries. A reminder that even the so-called experts were as confused as anyone else. Outside, the world feels brighter by comparison. You pass a midwife scolding a boy for throwing turnips, and a couple arguing quietly over a bundle of herbs. Mundane life continuing despite the madness written inside those dusty pages. You realize that for all the church's sermons and the doctor's theories, people were just as curious, just as flawed, and just as human as we are today. The path ahead calls again. Next, you'll follow the road where piety and desire intertwine. Pilgrimage routes where holy men forget their vows, and weary travelers find solace, not just in prayer, but in the arms of strangers far from home. You wake to the creak of wagon wheels and the low hum of a pilgrim's hymn echoing down a dusty road. The sun is already punishingly bright, its heat shimmering off the horizon, and you find yourself walking alongside a ragtag procession of travelers. Pilgrims, they call themselves. But as you look around, you realize they're more than just seekers of salvation. Some are barefoot, clutching rosaries and muttering prayers under their breath. Others carry sacks full of trinkets to sell along the way. And more than a few, judging by the sly glances and whispered jokes, are here for reasons that feel a lot less holy. This is a pilgrimage route, stretching toward Rome, Santiago, Canterbury, or even the Holy Land. On parchment maps, these roads are marked as sacred pathways, but in reality, they are as much about survival, business, and desire as they are about God. Pilgrimage, for many, is freedom, an escape from the village gossip, the heavy hand of the local priest, or the monotony of farm life. Out here, no one knows your name. You can reinvent yourself with every step, and sometimes that means shedding more than just your sins. You fall into step beside a monk dressed in a brown robe, sandals worn smooth, his eyes focused somewhere far ahead. He tells you he has taken vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity, though his voice falters a bit on that last one. It's different on the road, he mutters, glancing away. Pilgrimage has a way of shaking even the strongest vows. Far from their abbeys or parishioners, monks and priests often felt free to indulge in behaviors they'd never dare back home. Some saw the journey itself as an excuse, believing that sins committed along the road could be forgiven once they reached the shrine. After all, isn't that what penance is for? You pass a roadside tavern and step inside, drawn by the smell of ale and roasting meat. The place is crowded with travelers. A knight in chainmail boasts loudly about taking the cross while keeping one hand firmly planted on the barmaid's hip. In the corner, two men dressed as pilgrims are rolling dice for a woman's scarf, possibly stolen, definitely scented. It's hard not to notice the undertone of flirtation woven between the hymns and prayers. Pilgrimage, for some, is less about saving their souls and more about discovering someone else's body. Historians still argue whether this was a rare occurrence or a widespread, accepted reality of medieval travel. What we know for sure is that entire roadside economies sprang up to cater to these travelers: inns, bathhouses, and yes, brothels. Some brothels were disguised as rest houses for weary pilgrims. Others didn't even bother pretending. Along the route to Santiago de Compostela, Records describe temporary brothels appearing like mushrooms after rain, serving a steady flow of pilgrims who alternated between kissing relics and kissing strangers. Even the Crusades weren't immune to this mixture of piety and desire. When Richard the Lionheart led his forces to the Holy Land, he didn't just bring knights and weapons, he brought women, lots of them. Officially, they were laundresses and cooks. Unofficially, many were lovers, paid or otherwise. The church, of course, huffed and threatened hellfire, but nothing much changed. Crusades lasted for years, sometimes decades. Men wanted release, and women often sought protection, food, or even the chance for a new life far from home. You stumble across a soldier's diary tucked away in the archives of a German abbey. In neat, faded script, he writes, "We prayed at the tomb of Christ, and after, I lay with a girl from Acre. She smiled as if I had blessed her." It's not guilt you read between those lines. It's longing, remembrance, maybe even a touch of pride. To him, the holy and the sensual were not opposites, but part of the same journey. And it wasn't just the men. Women, too, walked these roads. Nuns, widows, merchants' wives, all risking their reputations and safety for reasons that weren't always purely spiritual. Traveling alone could brand a woman as suspicious or available, and the dangers were real. One infamous case involved a group of German nuns who were attacked by fellow pilgrims who turned out to be ex-soldiers with less than pious intentions. Despite the risks, many women still chose to go. Some disguised themselves as men, wrapping bindings around their chests and walking with heads low. Others traveled in groups, safety in numbers, and shared prayers. You hear the story of Beatrice, a weaver from Valencia, who claims she fell in love with a Breton pilgrim somewhere outside Genoa. "He said he'd write," she says with a shrug, "but letters don't walk." She doesn't sound bitter, just wistful, her voice catching slightly as she remembers his name. Pilgrimage love affairs, like the roads themselves, rarely lasted forever. Sometimes they were a single night, a single glance, and sometimes that was enough. The church, predictably, tried to clamp down on these behaviors. Priests preached that pilgrimage should be a time of reflection, not indulgence. Yet, ironically, some church leaders profited from the very sins they condemned. In certain towns, brothels along pilgrimage routes operated with the tacit approval of local clergy, provided they paid their taxes and offered the occasional penance fee. Medieval capitalism at its finest. Sin, confess, repeat. Here's your quirky fact of the night. In 14th century Florence, certain taverns on the pilgrimage route were rumored to provide a blessed ale, served by women who were both hostesses and informal confessors. The joke went that a pilgrim could wash away his sins and find new ones in the same hour. You can't help noticing that pilgrimage is less about purity and more about human contradiction. On one stretch of the road, you meet a man crawling barefoot as an act of penance, bleeding and praying with every step. On the next, you see a young couple leaning against a tree, hands entwined, eyes locked in a way that has nothing to do with Scripture. It's messy, imperfect, and utterly human. As dusk falls, the air cools, and the travelers begin to gather at a makeshift camp. Someone strikes up a song, half hymn, half tavern tune. A monk sits beside a woman with her hair loose, their fingers brushing just enough to tell a story all its own. The journey is not just about reaching a shrine. It's about everything that happens along the way, the temptations, the tenderness, the fleeting moments of warmth when the world feels uncertain. You wrap your cloak tighter as the stars come out, and the campfire sparks drift into the night. Tomorrow, the road will lead to new towns, new faces, and new confessions. But for now, you're content to watch the quiet dance of shadows and light, knowing that the pilgrimage is as much an inward journey as it is a path marked on any map. Next, you'll step into the dim interior of an apothecary, where love potions, dangerous elixirs, and whispered promises simmer just beneath the surface. Because when words fail, people will always try to bottle desire. You push open the door to an apothecary and are immediately hit with a wave of smells so intense they nearly make your eyes water. It's like stepping into a witch's pantry, or perhaps a kitchen, where love and death have been simmering in the same pot. Lavender, dried rose petals, and wormwood mingle with the bitter scent of crushed beetles and something vaguely animal, like old fur warmed by the sun. Glass jars line every shelf, each filled with strange ingredients: powdered roots, curled strips of dried bark, even something that looks suspiciously like snakeskin. The wooden counter is scarred with knife marks, and in the back, a woman with ink-stained fingers grinds something in a mortar. She looks up, squints, and gives you a faint smile. "Looking for something special?" she asks. "To cure or to cause?" Welcome to the shadowy world of medieval love potions and aphrodisiacs, where desire wasn't spoken aloud, but brewed, stirred, and slipped quietly into a goblet of wine. In a time when most marriages were arranged, love was a luxury, and desire could be downright dangerous. These concoctions offered the illusion of control. A few drops, a whispered incantation, and perhaps the merchant's son would finally glance your way, or your disinterested husband would return to your bed with fire in his eyes. Whether these potions truly worked is beside the point. The belief was powerful enough to make them feel like magic. The apothecary woman, her name, she tells you, is Bruna, takes down a bundle of dried yarrow tied with a red thread. "Boil this with honey," she instructs, "and have him drink it before sunset. If his eyes linger on your lips, you'll know." Yarrow was believed to stimulate passion, especially when paired with red wine, which was as much a symbol of life and warmth as it was a common drink. You watch as Bruna lays out other ingredients: sprigs of rosemary for memory and affection, crushed cinnamon bark to warm the blood, and tiny black seeds that she claims will make a man sigh without knowing why. Historians still argue whether these recipes were genuine attempts at chemistry or simply emotional placebos, rituals meant to soothe the hearts of the hopeful. Some of the ingredients were downright dangerous. Bruna gestures toward a small jar of Spanish fly, dried and powdered blister beetles. "Only a pinch," she warns, "or you'll have more problems than you started with." Spanish fly, notorious even in modern times, could cause swelling and a fevered flush, which people misinterpreted as passion. Too much of it, however, and you'd be more likely to end up in the grave than in anyone's arms. Nearby, a smaller jar bears the name monk's breath, a mix of parsley and galangale root, said to cool an overactive libido. Wives sometimes slipped it into their husband's soup when they feared wandering eyes, or nuns mixed it into their own herbal teas when guilt clawed at them. "Not everyone wants the fire," Bruna says softly. "Sometimes they want the opposite, quiet hearts, quiet nights. Her tone suggests she understands both sides. And then there's Mandrake. Bruna leads you to a crate where a tangle of roots, vaguely human-shaped, lies half buried in straw. "This one screams when you pull it," she says with a hint of mischief, "but it's worth it." The legend goes that Mandrake grew beneath gallows, nourished by the final emissions of hanged men. Its shriek, when uprooted, was said to kill anyone within earshot unless muffled by careful rituals. In smaller doses, it was believed to ignite desire, sharpen longing, and perhaps even foster dreams so vivid they lingered like ghosts. Here's your quirky fact of the night. In some corners of Eastern Europe, people believed that mixing rose oil with the seed collected from a linen bedsheet could make an irresistible love salve when applied to the wrists or lips. It's hard not to cringe at the thought, but it shows how far people would go for a chance at being desired. It wasn't all about romance, of course. Some potions were crafted for revenge. You spot a small vial labeled to sour his blood, a mix of mustard seed, vinegar, and grave dirt. Bruna lowers her voice when she explains. A few drops in his wine and he'll grow weak, less troublesome. Whether or not this actually worked, the power lay in the belief and in the fear it instilled. Historians debate how widely these practices were accepted. Some argue that love potions were little more than folklore, dismissed by educated elites but cherished by villagers. Others believe they were taken seriously enough to provoke real panic. After all, women accused of brewing love charms were often charged with witchcraft. In 1327, one woman was publicly flogged and exiled for allegedly causing a nobleman's unnatural obsession with her by boiling a love root in goat milk under a new moon. The man, predictably, faced no punishment, only a sermon and a pat on the back. Still, the recipes persisted. Mothers whispered them to daughters. Lovers scribbled notes in the margins of cookbooks, between instructions for stews and bread. A few particularly clever women stitched tiny charms into the hems of their dresses, carrying their secret magic wherever they went. One popular ritual involved tying bay leaves inscribed with a lover's name around your ankles and dancing under the full moon. If the leaves burned brightly when cast into a fire afterward, your love was true. If they hissed or sputtered, well, best to find someone else. Not all love magic was herbal. Some involved prayers, incantations, and even talismans. One charm required writing the names of the three magi, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, on a strip of parchment, then hiding it in your lover's shoe. The theory was that they would dream of you that night and wake with their heart tilted in your direction. Another method involved pressing a blessed coin to your tongue, whispering your beloved's name 9 times, and then swallowing a sip of spiced wine. If they glanced at you before sunset, the charm had worked. Was it magic, or just heightened confidence? Hard to say. The church, of course, hated all of this. Sermons railed against the dangers of unholy brews and demonic seduction. Priests warned that anyone who used such charms would invite hellfire upon their soul. But fear rarely stopped desire. People simply got quieter, passing recipes like contraband, hiding ingredients in false-bottomed boxes or behind altar cloths. You can almost imagine a peasant girl grinding nutmeg in her kitchen, whispering the name of the boy she's too shy to approach, praying the spice will do what her voice cannot. As you leave Bruna's apothecary, You pass a young woman with a wicker basket, a sprig of rosemary tucked behind her ear like a secret signal. She glances back just once, as if to see if anyone noticed. You did. Maybe someone else will too. Ahead, the path turns upward, toward the looming silhouette of a castle. You're about to step into a world where marriage is a chessboard, where love is secondary to land, titles, and politics. The firelight of desire still flickers there, but it burns beneath layers of silk, stone, and silence. You step through the heavy wooden doors of the Great Hall, and it feels as though the air itself shifts. Cooler, heavier, thick with the weight of centuries. The ceiling rises so high, it seems more like a statement than a structure. An attempt to impress God and anyone else who dares to enter. Tapestries drape the stone walls, depicting hunts, battles, and weddings that look more like negotiations than celebrations. There is no warmth here, no lingering sense of romance. This is where power lives, and it doesn't waste time on love stories. At the far end of the hall, on matching thrones, sit the lord and lady of this manor. She is 17, barely a woman, her gown a shade of muted rose designed to make her look older and more dignified. He is 34, his hair already thinning, his fingers tapping on the carved armrest, as if counting down to when this gathering will end. Their marriage wasn't chosen with the heart. It was planned, signed, and sealed years ago, when she was still a child and he needed another vineyard to cement his influence. Her dowry? 2 stretches of fertile land and a corner of disputed forest. His offer? A name, a castle, and the expectation of sons. Marriage in medieval Europe wasn't about 2 people finding each other in the chaos of life. It was about bloodlines, politics, and property. You can almost feel the weight of all those silent expectations pressing down on the lady as she sits beside her husband, their hands close, but never touching. Monogamy was the official rule. 1 man, 1 woman under God. But in practice, it was a suggestion that nobles bent and broke as needed. Kings kept mistresses like they kept hounds, and lords were expected to seek comfort outside the marriage bed if love or desire didn't bloom at home. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France was a political alliance, and by all accounts, a miserable one. He was pious and awkward. She was intelligent, outspoken, and frankly bored. After years of tension and 2 daughters but no male heir, the marriage was annulled. She went on to marry Henry II of England, bore him 8 children, and caused enough political intrigue to fill a dozen plays. Historians still argue whether her relationships outside of marriage were love affairs or power moves. But either way, she understood what marriage truly meant in her world. A contract, not a romance. For noble women, adultery was a dangerous game. A man caught straying might earn a scolding or a shrug. A woman caught straying could lose everything. Her title, her lands, even her life. In some regions, the punishment was imprisonment or forced confinement in a convent. In Brittany, a duchess accused of an affair with a knight was sewn into a sack and drowned. Her lover? He was beaten, reassigned to a distant estate, and lived to see another day. Justice, medieval style, rarely had equal scales. Yet not all women accepted this quietly. Some wielded their own influence, not with swords or crowns, but with wit, beauty, and strategic defiance. You hear whispers of a Castilian queen who openly kept lovers, one of whom, a poet, described her touch as fierce as a lioness and her gaze as commanding as any king's. The court tried to erase her name from the records, but her verses, attributed to her lover, still speak of her fire. Wealthy merchants, too, played this game of arranged unions. In cities like Florence and Bruges, marriage was as much about business contracts as it was about family. Wives were expected to be quiet, fertile, and dressed appropriately. There are records of men fining their wives for wearing unapproved colors or fabrics. One merchant penalized his spouse 10 silver coins for daring to wear green silk without permission. Another forbade his wife from singing during supper, claiming it was too joyful for a respectable matron. Meanwhile, these same men frequented brothels under the guise of business meetings, their hypocrisy stitched into the fabric of daily life. Here's your quirky fact of the night. In 14th century Italy, noblemen sometimes arranged for their wives to have official companions, younger men, often poets or musicians, tasked with escorting them to social events. This custom, known as friari, was supposedly Platonic. Of course, everyone knew that what started as a courtly poem or a shared song might turn into something less innocent. A few of these companions ended up immortalized in love poetry or quietly included in the lady's will. The church tried to enforce its vision of sacred marriage, preaching that love should remain within the sanctified boundaries of one man and one woman. Priests gave fiery sermons on fidelity, chastity, and the dangers of temptation. But strangely, these lectures often skipped over the powerful men who broke the rules. The moral burden fell hardest on women and peasants, while nobles treated these ideals as optional suggestions. Divorce, as we know it, didn't exist. An annulment was possible, but only with a convincing excuse, proving that the marriage hadn't been consummated, or that the couple was related within prohibited degrees, which, in medieval Europe, wasn't hard to claim. Some couples tried to trick the church with creative arguments. One man claimed his wife's unbearable smell made intimacy impossible, while she countered that he simply didn't know what he was doing. The court sided with her. You can almost imagine the smug smile she must have worn on the way out. Kings, crusaders, and merchants often had unofficial second wives or concubines, especially when far from home. Crusaders returning from the Holy Land sometimes brought back children born of temporary unions abroad. These relationships weren't recognized by the church, but they were tolerated as long as they didn't threaten legitimate heirs. In some cases, these second families were quietly provided for, their children raised just outside the circle of official nobility. Historians still argue whether romantic love existed within marriage during this time. Some letters between noble couples suggest real tenderness. A knight wrote to his wife during a campaign, "Your absence wounds me like a blade, and your letters are my only bandage." Sweet, isn't it? But such affection was rare compared to the transactional nature of most unions. Marriage was work. It was public, strategic, and tightly controlled. Love, if it bloomed at all, was often found outside the official bonds. You leave the great hall as the fire crackles low, casting long shadows on the stone floor. Somewhere above, the newlyweds are being watched by attendants, who will later report whether the marriage bed was properly warmed. It's less about intimacy and more about securing the family line. Whether desire will come later or not, nobody seems to care. the alliance is sealed. The land is secured. Everything else is an afterthought. Outside, the evening air tastes of damp earth and smoke. You glance back at the towering castle walls, wondering how many quiet heartbreaks they have witnessed. Marriage here isn't the fairy tale. It's the battleground where duty and desire constantly clash. And next, you'll slip beneath those walls, down into the places where secrets are born, into the chambers where illegitimate children cry softly into wool blankets, their futures uncertain before they've even opened their eyes. The hallway narrows as you leave the echoing Great Hall, and you can almost feel the shift from public grandeur to private secrets. The steps creak beneath your boots, spiraling down toward the lower levels of the manor, where warmth fades and shadows cling to the corners like cobwebs. A midwife leads the way, her hands stained with ash and herbs, her face tight with something between resignation and defiance. You follow, ducking under low beams, past storerooms lined with barrels of wine and salted meat. Down here, the smell is different. Smoke, damp wool, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. She pushes open a wooden door, and you step into a small chamber tucked behind the kitchen. A fire snaps weakly in the hearth, barely keeping the chill at bay. On a rough straw mattress lies a young woman, pale and trembling, cradling a newborn wrapped in a thin blanket. Her eyes are swollen from crying, but not from joy. The child, red-faced and squalling, is not cause for celebration. It was born in secrecy, outside the sacred bonds of marriage, and that means trouble. Illegitimacy in medieval society was more than a family scandal. It was a legal and spiritual stain, a mark that could shape a life before it even began. Everything depended on who your parents were and how willing they were to claim you. The father of this child, you're told in hushed whispers, is a nobleman sleeping soundly upstairs beside his lawfully wedded wife. He will never openly acknowledge the baby. He already has a legitimate heir, plump, rosy, and watched by 4 nurses. For this servant girl and her child, there will be no tapestries or carved cradles, only quiet arrangements. A purse of coins, perhaps. Maybe a place in a convent when the girl is old enough. Or maybe nothing at all. Among peasants, the rules were looser, but also harsher. A child born out of wedlock still carried shame, but the social consequences weren't as devastating, unless the father refused to take responsibility. Many villages imposed bastardy fines. The man paid a small fee, and the woman performed public penance, often barefoot in the churchyard, head bowed, while the priest recited her sins. Afterward, life went on, but the whispers lingered. A young woman with a child and no husband might never marry. Her options were limited: beg, find work as a washerwoman, or hope that someone, perhaps a friar with a soft heart, took pity on her. In the noble class, illegitimacy was a game played with calculated rules and quiet hypocrisy. Kings and dukes had official mistresses, complete with households, servants, and even titles. Their children, though technically illegitimate, were often raised just a step below legitimate heirs. Charles II of Navarre, for instance, openly kept his favorite mistress in a tower near the castle, sending his wife polite letters filled with apologies and absolutely no intention of ending the affair. The children of these liaisons were educated, given land, and sometimes married into minor nobility. It was an open secret, part of the fabric of aristocratic life. William the Conqueror himself was branded William the Bastard before he seized the English throne in 1066. His illegitimacy didn't hinder his ambition. In fact, he seemed to wear the insult like armor, proving, with every conquest, that bloodlines were not destiny. But not every child of such unions was so lucky. Illegitimate sons were often barred from inheriting titles unless legitimized by royal decree or papal blessing. Daughters fared even worse. A nobleman's bastard daughter might be married off to a low-ranking knight or sent to a convent. If she was beautiful, she might follow her mother's path as someone's mistress. But love rarely entered the equation. Here's your quirky fact of the night. In 13th century England, there was an official legal term for these children: filius nullius, meaning son of no one. Imagine growing up with that written in court documents. It wasn't just social erasure. It was legal exile. These children were often denied inheritance, barred from certain guilds, and treated as perpetual outsiders unless their families intervened. Some tried to cheat the system. Forged marriage contracts were surprisingly common. You come across a brittle parchment tucked away in an old chest, a fake document with crude handwriting, claiming that a nobleman had secretly married his mistress years before. For a while, this ruse worked. Their son was treated as legitimate, even groomed for inheritance. Then the real priest returned from a pilgrimage, saw the forged signature, and exposed the lie. The boy was stripped of his claim overnight. The mistress, mysteriously, fell ill not long after. You don't ask too many questions, but there were times when love tried to win. Some couples married after a child was born, hoping that a late wedding would wipe the slate clean. Canon law wrestled with this issue for centuries. Could marriage retroactively legitimize children? Some popes said yes. Others said absolutely not. Historians still argue whether these shifting rules were acts of mercy or thinly veiled attempts to control inheritance and keep power in the right hands. Not all stories end in tragedy, though. You meet a boy named Thomas, the son of a wealthy merchant and his seamstress mistress. His father never married his mother, but paid for Thomas's education and apprenticed him to a scribe. Now grown, Thomas writes contracts for land deals, his handwriting neat as lacework. "My mother gave me her name," he says, smiling faintly. "My father gave me his coin. That's enough." It's not a fairy tale, but it's survival. In the cities, illegitimacy gradually lost some of its sting. Wealth and skill could outweigh birth, especially if the child had useful talents. In Florence, you read about the bastard son of a banker who became a respected painter, his patrons caring more for his brushwork than his parentage. In some guilds, a talented bastard could even rise to leadership if he proved himself. Historians still debate whether this was rare or surprisingly common. Was society more flexible than we think? Or were these exceptions just lucky stars in a dark sky? As you leave the chamber, the newborn's cries soften to whimpers. The midwife hums a lullaby, her face unreadable. Upstairs, the nobleman sleeps beside his legitimate wife, dreaming perhaps of neither. Between them lies a quiet story, a child born in the wrong bed, but not without worth. And as you step out into the cool night air, you realize something that rings true across the centuries. For all the laws, sermons, and punishments, the heart has always found ways to break the rules. Next, you'll leave these secret chambers for stranger spaces, places where desire and faith intertwine, in dangerous ways. Out in the forests and meadows, far from the eyes of bishops, there are heretics who preach that pleasure is divine, that love itself can be a form of prayer. You're about to meet the radicals who saw sex not as sin, but as salvation. The manor fades behind you, its polished corridors and whispered scandals giving way to open fields and winding dirt paths. The air feels freer here, but also heavier with something unspoken. You're moving beyond the boundaries of sanctioned religion and noble propriety, stepping into places where the church's grip loosens and wild ideas take root. It doesn't take long to find them. The heretics, the radicals, the believers who dared to claim that the body was holy, not sinful, and that desire could be a form of prayer. The path leads to a clearing, a natural amphitheater surrounded by trees that seem to lean inward. Listening, a fire burns low at the center, sending up spirals of smoke scented with pine and something sweeter, almost like burning roses. Around it, men and women sit cross-legged in simple wool cloaks. No priests, no altar, no Latin chants, just quiet defiance and the soft hum of a song that feels older than scripture. A man named Elias beckons you closer. He's broad-shouldered, his fingers ink-stained from copying texts, and his eyes shine with the intensity of someone who has glimpsed a forbidden truth. He tells you they are the brethren of the free spirit, a loose but infamous movement that sprang up in parts of the Holy Roman Empire during the 13th and 14th centuries. Their belief, he explains, is disarmingly simple and utterly blasphemous to the Church. Once a soul is fully united with God, it transcends sin. Anything done in that state, even the things the Church calls sinful, is not only acceptable, but holy. Even sex, you ask, though you already know the answer. Elias smiles, unbothered. Especially sex, he says, as if talking about prayer. The Church's reaction to these ideas was predictably violent. The brethren rejected sacraments, ignored priests, and insisted that divine love could be accessed through human touch. One mystic woman famously declared, "I am God, and everything I do is holy." You can imagine how well that went over with the bishops. But for people trapped in lives of fear, sin, and guilt, the message was intoxicating. Pleasure didn't separate you from God. It brought you closer. Marguerite Porete, a mystic associated with these circles, wrote a book called The Mirror of Simple Souls, which spoke of surrendering to divine love so completely that moral laws no longer applied. The Church burned her at the stake in 1310, yet her words survived in secret copies passed from hand to hand, like love letters to a forbidden god. Historians still argue whether Porete herself engaged in sexual mysticism, but others certainly did. Records from inquisitors, biased, yes, but detailed, describe communities where people stripped naked during rituals, not only as symbols of purity, but as a literal return to the Garden of Eden. You meet Clara, a woman in her 30s with sharp, watchful eyes and a crescent-shaped scar at her temple. Her voice is soft but steady when she speaks about her faith. The flesh, she says, is the scroll where God writes. For her, desire isn't shameful. It's divine. She describes rituals where lovers recite psalms during climax, where kissing becomes a sacrament, where touch is both prayer and confession. It's shocking, yes, but also oddly tender. No one here is trying to shock the world. They just believe the world has been reading the wrong book all along. Not everyone in the group is so serene. Some look nervous, glancing toward the trees as if expecting the church to send soldiers at any moment. And they're right to be cautious. The Inquisition took these movements seriously. In France, Germany, and the Low Countries, inquisitors wrote feverish accounts of orgies in the name of God, though whether these accusations were true or just propaganda is still debated. Historians still argue whether these groups were truly radical communities or simply scapegoats for the church's fear of losing control. Then there were the Adamites, a sect in 14th century Bohemia who rejected clothing entirely. They lived communally, danced naked under the stars, and claimed to have returned to the state of innocence that Adam and Eve once knew. For them, nudity wasn't indecent, it was divine. Unfortunately, their Eden didn't last. The church sent armed forces to root them out. Few survived to tell their story. As you sit by the fire, a young couple named Mira and John share their experience. They once lived as a typical married pair under the official church, but felt suffocated by the endless rules. Here, they say, they've found something freer. Sometimes they share partners with others in the group, but always with consent. Always with the belief that every touch is blessed. They don't look like rebels. They look calm, grounded, even happy, like people who've made peace with their bodies. You can feel the tension in the air, though. These people are constantly on the edge of discovery, always a rumor or accusation away from torture, imprisonment, or worse. One former member of a similar sect was burned alive simply for claiming she felt God's presence most strongly in moments of passion. The word fornication was underlined in the trial records, as if the scribes couldn't quite believe someone would claim holiness in something so human. It strikes you just how radical this idea really is. To take something the church has labeled shameful and claim it as sacred. To say, my pleasure connects me to the divine, not to damnation. It's dangerous thinking, transformative thinking, and perhaps that's why movements like these keep appearing in history, like stubborn wildflowers that bloom even after being trampled. They remind you that control, no matter how strong, can never fully crush the human spirit. The fire burns lower. Someone begins singing, a simple melody about love and freedom, and the sound blends with the crackle of wood. You stand, brushing dirt from your cloak, and look up at the sky. Stars glimmer between the branches, unbothered by dogma or doctrine. You leave the clearing with a strange mix of unease and admiration, carrying with you the sense that faith and desire, once separated, can sometimes lead to something startlingly true. Next, you'll step behind the walls of monasteries and convents, where abstinence is supposed to rule and longing is locked away behind stone. But even there, desire has a way of carving its initials into the quiet, echoing halls. The forest thins, and the world of radical sex fades behind you, replaced by the quiet symmetry of monastic life. You follow a worn path to a cluster of stone buildings, low and austere against the horizon. A bell tolls in the distance, its tone neither welcoming nor forbidding, just a reminder that time here moves in disciplined measures. The monastery looms like a fortress, not of soldiers, but of silence. You step through its archway, feeling as if the air itself has grown heavier, saturated with centuries of whispered prayers and unspoken longing. The courtyard is orderly, with rows of herbs growing in neat beds, their fragrance mingling with the cool scent of wet stone. A few monks move about in silence, their brown robes brushing against the ground like whispers. They pass without meeting your eyes, but their glances are not unkind. This is a place built on routines, dawn prayers, midday chants, evening reflection. But beneath the rhythm, there's tension, a subtle current of suppressed emotion, like a note that hums beneath the surface of a song. You sit in the cloister, a covered walkway open to the courtyard, and watch as a novice monk polishes a wooden cross with meticulous care. His fingers linger on the edges, almost caressing it. He looks young, perhaps not even 20, and you wonder how many desires he's had to bury just to stay here. Historians still argue whether medieval monasteries were truly havens of chastity or simply places where longing took on new, subtler forms. The evidence suggests a bit of both. The rules were strict, of course. Celibacy was the foundation of monastic life, meant to keep the mind pure and the soul focused on God. But anyone who has ever tried to stop themselves from thinking about something knows how quickly the mind rebels. One chronicler from the 12th century admitted that monks were often plagued by nocturnal temptations, dreams so vivid they felt like real encounters. To counter this, some orders imposed harsh punishments: cold baths, fasting, or sleeping on hard boards with arms crossed over the chest, as if preparing for death, rather than dreaming of life. Still, desire crept in. It came in the form of a lingering glance at a fellow novice during evening chants or in the warmth of shared labor. Two monks side by side in the fields, hands brushing by accident. It surfaced in the confessions of monks who spoke of sisterly affections for nuns or fellow brothers, cloaked in language that barely disguised the longing beneath. Some monasteries even recorded incidents of romantic attachments that scandalized the order. A few were punished, others quietly separated, and some simply endured, unspoken and unresolved. You recall a curious tale from England: a monk who carved small, secret figures into the wooden beams of the scriptorium. Most were saints, but hidden among them was a pair of lovers, their faces almost touching, their robes blending as if to hide their sin. Centuries later, restorers found these carvings and debated whether they were acts of rebellion or merely reminders of human frailty. Historians still argue whether such images were tolerated as warnings or simply overlooked. The convents weren't immune either. Women who joined the cloister brought their own hearts and histories with them. Letters survive from nuns to priests or even to other nuns, filled with language so tender, it's hard not to see it as romantic. One 13th century letter from a nun to her dearest companion in Christ reads less like a sermon and more like a love note. Your absence leaves me hollow, like a cup waiting for wine. The church might call it spiritual devotion, but you can almost hear the sigh between the lines. A nun named Sister Agnes once confessed to seeing visions of angels who kissed her forehead and whispered divine secrets into her ear. Some claimed she was touched by grace. Others suspected her of simply longing for touch. And then there's the story of Hildegard of Bingen, the brilliant abbess, composer, and mystic whose visions of divine love were often described in language so sensual that modern scholars debate whether they were purely spiritual or tinged with earthly desire. Hildegard herself believed the body and soul were not enemies, but companions, an idea far more radical than most of her contemporaries would admit. In the refectory, where monks eat in silence while one reads aloud from scripture, you notice the way their eyes sometimes wander. The food is simple: bread, broth, a bit of cheese. But hunger isn't just about the stomach, and you can sense other appetites gnawing at the edges. One monk scratches a note onto a small wax tablet. Later, you peek and see only a single word: forgive. It's unclear if he's asking God's forgiveness or his own. The church, of course, feared this undercurrent. Sermons warned that even the smallest indulgence of the flesh could corrupt the entire soul. Manuals advised nuns to avoid unnecessary closeness with each other, and monks were told to sleep with their hands above the blankets, as if that could guard against dreams. Yet for all these rules, humanity persisted. In some accounts, confessions of longing became almost poetic, with monks describing how a single smile from a passing pilgrim haunted their prayers for weeks. And here's your fringe fact of the night. In certain regions, monks and nuns were sometimes caught writing erotic poetry disguised as religious allegory. One famous example involves a sequence of Latin verses that seem to describe a soul's union with God. But upon closer reading, it's filled with imagery of kissing, touching, and even sighing in unison. Scholars still argue whether these were accidental slips of language or deliberate coded expressions of suppressed desire. You walk through the cloister garden, the air heavy with lavender and rosemary. The setting sun casts a warm light over the stone walls, turning them almost golden. Somewhere, a bell rings for evening prayer. The monks gather in the chapel, their chants rising like smoke. The sound is beautiful, haunting even. But you can't help but feel the tension beneath it. How many of them have whispered forbidden names into the dark? How many have struggled to balance devotion with desire? As night falls, you leave the monastery with a sense of quiet unease. The walls behind you seem to hum with secrets, with centuries of longing carved into the grain of the wood and the cracks of the stone. Next, you'll descend into a stranger corner of history where animals, yes, animals, are put on trial, accused of crimes they could never understand, and sometimes punished for the sins of their human neighbors. The monastery's silence fades behind you as you follow a narrow road that dips into a valley. The air shifts here. It's sharper, tinged with the smell of wet hay and something unmistakably barnyard. You're heading toward one of the strangest chapters of medieval history, where courts weren't reserved for humans alone. Yes, this is the world of animal trials, a bizarre intersection of law, superstition, and misplaced morality that somehow made perfect sense to the people of the time. The village square ahead looks ordinary at first glance. A few wooden stalls, a stone fountain, and a small church with a crooked spire. But today, it's transformed into a makeshift courtroom. Villagers gather, murmuring and crossing themselves, their faces a mix of fear and curiosity. At the center of it all, chained to a post, is the accused, a pig, its snout caked with mud, squealing as if it knows something is terribly wrong. You take a seat on a rough bench beside an old scribe who's sharpening his quill. He informs you that the pig is on trial for carnal knowledge of a child. The words delivered with grim solemnity. The prosecutor, a local priest, steps forward and reads the indictment aloud, voice trembling, with what sounds like both disgust and self-righteousness. The pig scratches at the ground, entirely oblivious to the proceedings. You almost want to laugh, but the crowd's seriousness silences you. This wasn't an isolated case. Across medieval Europe, animals were brought to court and sentenced as if they were moral beings capable of sin. In 1386, in Falaise, France, a pig was dressed in human clothes, tried for murder, and hanged in the public square. The event was so well documented that illustrations of the execution still survive. Historians still argue whether these trials were symbolic rituals meant to restore divine order, or just grim theater to distract people from the harsher realities of life. The scribe beside you leans in and mutters, "If we don't punish the beast, God's justice falters." To him, this isn't absurdity, it's cosmic housekeeping. Animals, in the medieval mindset, were part of God's hierarchy. If they violated it by killing, maiming, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, they threatened the delicate balance of the world. But not all animals were condemned. In one particularly strange case from Burgundy, a donkey accused of lewd behavior was acquitted because multiple villagers testified to its modesty and Christian demeanor. Yes, you heard that right. A donkey's good character was defended in court as if it were a respectable citizen. You can't make this up. The deeper truth, though, is darker. These trials often had less to do with animals and more to do with human guilt, fear, and projection. When something went wrong, a child injured, a field destroyed, it was easier to blame a pig or a goat than to confront uncomfortable truths about negligence, violence, or abuse. A scapegoat, quite literally. You catch sight of a group of children chasing a chicken near the edge of the square. The bird's clucking echoes like nervous laughter. The priest raises his voice now, warning the crowd that the pig's crime is not just against the child, but against God's order. "Evil wears many shapes," he intones. The villagers nod, some casting uneasy glances at their own livestock. And here's your fringe fact of the night. In 1474, a rooster in Basel, Switzerland, was put on trial for laying an egg. Since roosters aren't supposed to lay eggs, the townspeople decided the egg must be the spawn of the devil, destined to hatch a basilisk, a mythical creature whose gaze could kill. The rooster was found guilty and burned at the stake, alongside its cursed egg. It's both horrifying and absurd, like a Monty Python sketch with real stakes. You leave the square and wander into the church where the trial will conclude. Inside, the air is thick with incense, as if someone's trying to cover the smell of fear. A bailiff leads the pig to a makeshift dock, its squeals bouncing off the stone walls. The priest calls for witnesses. A farmer claims the animal looked at him with sinful eyes. Another says its behavior was unnatural, though he can't quite explain what that means. The crowd murmurs approval. The scribe shakes his head. "We punish them to remind ourselves," he says softly. "Remind ourselves that sin must always have a price." His tone is weary, as if he knows how hollow the ritual really is. Historians still argue about the purpose of these trials. Some see them as a form of community theater, a way to reinforce social order by showing that justice applied to all creatures, even animals. Others believe they were simply scapegoating rituals, diverting blame from human mistakes to mute, defenseless beasts. Either way, the spectacle served its purpose, to remind people of the power of the church, the law, and the unseen forces that supposedly governed their lives. You leave just as the verdict is read. The pig will be executed at dawn. Outside, children laugh and chase their chicken again, as if nothing has happened. Life, bizarre and brutal, moves on. And you can't shake the feeling that these trials say less about animals and more about us. Our need to find something, anything, to punish when the world feels out of control. Next, you'll step into a darker chapter still, where the world itself seems to be dying. The plague is coming. And with it, desire and despair will twist together in ways no courtroom could ever contain. The coughing starts before you even see the village. At first, it's distant and dry, like twigs snapping underfoot. But as you draw closer, it deepens, wet, ragged, a sound that feels like something tearing itself out from inside a body. The air has changed, too. It's heavy, metallic, and sour, carrying the unmistakable scent of rot just beginning. The plague is here. Bubonic, the Black Death, call it what you will. It doesn't care. It's already rewriting the rhythm of life and death in every corner of this place. A cart rumbles past you, its wooden wheels groaning. It carries more limbs than it should, shapes beneath the blanket that don't add up. Someone throws a rosary after it, as if that will help. Someone else, unable to hold it in, vomits on the cobblestones. You pause, your breath tight in your chest, because even if you aren't sick, this world smells like fear. And yet, amidst this terror, you see something unexpected. People still touching, still reaching for each other, still desperate to feel alive when death is already in the room. The tavern is one of the few places still open, and you step inside to find it strangely full. The barkeep is coughing into his sleeve, but he's still pouring ale, his movements sharp with the urgency of someone who knows time is short. Two men argue loudly about whether the world will end in fire or frogs. A woman, laughing a little too hard, is perched on a man's lap, kissing him between drinks as though defiance could be found in each breath. The air smells of sweat, yeast, and fear all stirred into one bitter brew. You sit beside a weaver named Hal. His eyes are rimmed red, and he tells you he's lost 3 brothers this week alone. He hasn't blinked much since Tuesday. We're all damned, he says casually, as if commenting on the weather. Might as well have some warmth on the way down. His words are not unique. Across Europe, as the plague swept through towns, people found themselves clinging to pleasure as a way to mock death, to keep it at bay, even for a few fleeting moments. If everything is ending, why not kiss harder? Why not hold someone close, if only to remind yourself you're still here? Historians still argue whether the Black Death fueled a surge of erotic behavior or simply revealed what was always simmering under the surface. Some records suggest brothels saw a spike in visits during plague years. Others hint at spontaneous affairs and public displays of affection, as if everyone collectively decided that the rules no longer applied. It wasn't just about lust. It was about feeling something, anything, before the coughing began. One chronicler from Avignon wrote bitterly of men who had never set foot in a brothel, suddenly spending their last coins in one, declaring love with every dying breath. His tone dripped with judgment, but you can't help but sense a hint of envy. And here's your fringe fact of the night. In Paris, during a particularly vicious wave of the plague, city authorities quietly protected certain brothels, considering them relief services. As one official reportedly wrote, "If the people must die, let them at least forget." Medieval capitalism, twisted as it was, found a way to monetize even death's shadow. The church, of course, was furious. Priests thundered from pulpits, calling the plague a punishment for sexual sin. They railed against those who continued to indulge in desire while the world around them was crumbling. The fornicators, one monk wrote, stir God's wrath into pestilence. It has a poetic ring to it, but it didn't stop anyone. People have a way of ignoring sermons when mortality is standing at the door. Flagellant movements sprang up in response. Groups of men and women who whipped themselves through the streets, bleeding and chanting, begging for forgiveness. They believed that by punishing their own bodies, they might draw God's mercy. Some forbade sex entirely, claiming abstinence could shield them from death. Others slipped into a kind of ecstatic trance during their rituals, moaning and writhing with an intensity that looked suspiciously like something else. Historians still debate whether these were spiritual experiences or thinly veiled expressions of suppressed desire. You meet a young woman named Elsa, cheeks hollowed from hunger and sleepless nights, eyes haunted but still alive. She tells you quietly that she slept with the same man who buried her sister. "We didn't mean to," she says, voice trembling. "We just didn't want to be alone. Not that night. The man is dead now. She isn't, yet." Her story stays with you, because it's not about sin or virtue. It's about loneliness and the way human touch can feel like salvation when the world is ending. Not all of these encounters were gentle. The breakdown of social order meant that exploitation, too, ran rampant. Women were forced into sex for shelter or food. Children were abandoned, sometimes sold. There are accounts of men robbing plague corpses, then returning to their lovers without even washing their hands. The sickness didn't just rot lungs, it rotted conscience. And yet, even amidst this decay, there's resilience. You step outside the tavern and see a makeshift shelter beyond the town wall. Two figures share a thin blanket, their fingers barely brushing, but the quiet connection between them carries more weight than any sermon. They aren't pretending they're safe. They aren't even pretending they're clean. They're just choosing to feel something before the lights go out. Scholars today still wrestle with this paradox. Did the plague make people more reckless, or simply more human? Was the rise in intimacy a form of rebellion against despair, or just a desperate clinging to life? The truth is likely both. When you have nothing left to lose, holding another person can feel like victory. As you leave the village, the coughing fades behind you. The night is heavy, the stars cold and sharp. Somewhere, another cart is being loaded. Somewhere else, a kiss is pressed to a fevered cheek. The world is ending, and yet stubbornly, life goes on. Next, you'll walk toward the final shadows of this journey, into cathedrals and graveyards where love, lust, and memory are carved in stone, whispering secrets that even death can't silence. The cathedral rises ahead of you like a ship carved from shadow, its spires cutting into a sky bruised with twilight. The bells are silent now, but their weight lingers in the air, as if they've been tolling for centuries and can still be heard in the bones of the city. You walk toward it slowly, boots echoing on damp cobblestones slick with yesterday's rain. This feels like the end of the journey, not just yours, but theirs, the Lord's, the lovers, the sinners, the saints. You've seen them in beds and brothels, behind cloistered walls and beneath plague-ridden blankets. Now you've come to the place where they all eventually end up, remembered, rewritten, or forgotten. Inside, the light is dim. Colored glass scatters shards of crimson and gold across the flagstones, painting the floor with the fractured faces of saints who seem both solemn and smug. The air smells of wax and dust, of old prayers layered like sediment. You pass rows of wooden pews, worn smooth by knees and grief, and make your way to the tombs, stone coffins stacked along the walls, carved into the floor, and lined with Latin inscriptions that promise virtues the dead may or may not have possessed. You pause at one. A knight lies in full armor, a woman beside him, both hands folded, eyes closed, lips parted just slightly as if caught between a prayer and a sigh. Lovers cast in stone, and yet you can't help but wonder, did they even like each other? Death in the Middle Ages was omnipresent. People prepared for it obsessively, wrote wills as often as letters, and purchased indulgences like travelers buying insurance before a long, uncertain trip. And still, desire clung to them. Who had touched whom? Who had strayed? Who carried secrets to the grave that no priest ever heard? One monument bears a name that's been scratched out and replaced. The grooves of the original letters, faintly visible. Rumor has it that the man buried there was excommunicated for keeping 2 wives, one in town, one in the countryside, neither aware of the other until his funeral. They apparently met while placing flowers, and the encounter ended with someone throwing a candle. Death may have claimed him, but his memory burned on in scandal. The language on these tombs is its own art form. Faithful husband, beloved wife, pillar of virtue, all coded, all curated. Chaste sometimes meant got caught and repented. Modest could mean kept her secrets well. You read of a widow buried with a carved lily and the word pudica, meaning pure, only to discover later that court records reveal she ran a high-end brothel out of her wine cellar. Somehow, that makes her more interesting than the epitaph ever could. And then there's the art. Lust and death shared the same palette here. You trace the lines of a stained glass window depicting Mary Magdalene, not kneeling in shame, but washing Christ's feet with her hair, her face tender, almost intimate. Behind her, a bishop scowls, as though even he can feel the discomfort she causes. For centuries, Magdalene was the church's favorite symbol of fallen womanhood and redemption, a convenient way to package female sexuality, to turn longing into a moral lesson. On a nearby column, someone long ago carved 2 intertwined figures, their faces rough and weathered by time, but their position unmistakable. You wonder if it was a bored mason working on a dare, or perhaps a secret tribute to a love he could never speak aloud. Desire has always found ways to seep into the cracks, even in places designed to suppress it. In a side chapel, you find a display of death masks. Wax faces painted to resemble the deceased stare back at you, most stoic, a few almost smiling. One has lips parted just slightly, teeth barely showing. The plaque beneath it names her as a noble woman who died in childbirth. Yet, her journals survived, and in them, she wrote vividly of a lover she never named. "He touched my face like I might vanish," she wrote. She never mentioned her husband once. And here's your fringe fact of the night. Some medieval tombs included something called transy sculptures, dual effigies, showing the person in life on the top, and beneath that, a rotting corpse carved in exacting detail, flesh above, decay below, a reminder that beauty fades, bones endure, and lust, no matter how vivid, eventually ends here, or seems to. Yet even in death, desire found echoes. Ghost stories abound of widows dreaming of long-dead lovers, of spectral touches and cold kisses in the dark. Monks wrote of temptations lingering in their sleep, the voices of old loves whispering from beyond. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly obsessed with death or simply more honest about its presence. Some believe the art and rituals reveal a society terrified of judgment, desperate to make sense of life's fleeting joys. Others suggest that they saw death and desire not as contradictions, but as companions, two forces that defined what it meant to be human. The gravestones don't tell the whole story, but the spaces between them, the rough stone, the secret carvings, the untold scandals, hint at a truth the church could never quite silence. You step outside as the cathedral bells finally begin to toll. A funeral procession passes, mourners cloaked in black, a casket of polished oak carried on broad shoulders. Incense trails behind them, thin and ghost-like. Among them walks a woman clutching a silver locket to her chest. You don't need to ask what's inside. You already know. A lock of hair, a pressed flower, a memory no one else will claim. The wind shifts, carrying with it the smell of rain and old wood. You find yourself standing at the edge of this world, the one that felt eternal, and yet so fragile, so stained by longing. You've traced the arc of medieval lust, from the giggles behind market stalls to the ritualized silences of convent walls. You've seen how people touched, confessed, denied, burned, and finally were buried. And still, the story isn't over. Next, as the last light fades and the shadows stretch long across the stones, you'll follow the lingering whispers of those who dared to want. The final rooms of this journey await, where desire, memory, and time merge into something softer, slower, and deeply human. The fire is low now, casting lazy shadows that flicker across forgotten corners of memory. You sit for a moment, quiet, letting everything you've seen over this long journey fold itself neatly into your thoughts. The laughter that spilled out of taverns like spilled ale. The whispered prayers behind cloistered doors, where candlelight trembled as if even wax was shy of the secrets it illuminated. The creak of a bed frame in a convent that should not have known that sound. All of it swirls together now. Tenderness and shame, rule and rebellion, like smoke curling toward a sky that will forget it by morning. History, you realize, is rarely neat. It doesn't sit politely in scrolls or parchment pages. It lingers in gestures, in silences, in soft confessions spoken into the wrong ear at the wrong time. And medieval history? It's messy, intimate, and unashamed of its contradictions. The very same society that built cathedrals high enough to kiss the clouds also carved tiny erotic jokes into their pews, as if winking at future generations. They feared sin with all their hearts, and yet they found ways to sneak it into every corner of life. You think back to the women who moved through this world like fire hidden under a cloak. The merchant's wife who managed her husband as shrewdly as any lord. The healer, Tilda, on the edge of the woods, who refused to need anyone, even if it meant being called a witch. The brewing guild of hop sisters, who raised their prices when men complained and smiled like they just solved a riddle the church could never answer. Were they rebels? Survivors? Historians still argue whether these women were anomalies or proof that the medieval rules were never as rigid as they seemed. Maybe they were both. Maybe they were simply human, loud, clever, flawed, alive. Desire, too, was never simple. It shimmered like silk in a market stall, strategic, dangerous, irresistible. It whispered in fabrics, dyed with lapis, and hemmed with a hint of scandal. It lingered in the unbound hair of a noblewoman, or the laugh of a servant girl balancing a basket of turnips. The church tried to smother it with sumptuary laws and sermons that sounded suspiciously like threats, but people just found new ways to play the game. A ribbon tucked into a sleeve, a glove dropped too casually, a handkerchief that said more than any confession ever could. You can still picture the codpieces, ridiculous and proud, stuffed and embroidered like the medieval version of a flex on social media. Scholars debate whether they were about status or sexuality, but honestly, why not both? If the shoes were long enough to trip you and the doublets were tight enough to cut off circulation, it was probably all part of the charm. Fashion wasn't frivolous. It was a language of power and desire. It let people show just enough of themselves to be noticed without ever needing to say a word. And then, as night deepened, came the demons. Not just the ones whispered about in sermons, but the ones that crept into dreams, disguised as familiar lovers, or strange shadowed figures with burning eyes. You remember the shepherd's story of the succubus slipping through walls, or the nun who blamed her bruised thighs on a visitation from hell. Was it fear? Was it longing? Historians still argue whether these tales were repressions made flesh, or simply a way to explain feelings no one dared name. Maybe both. In a world that taught you desire was sin, it must have been easier to say, "The devil made me do it," than to admit your own body wanted what it wanted. Medicine didn't help much either. The so-called experts scribbled about female anatomy as if it were a map drawn by someone who had never left their house. 7 chambers of the womb? Monsters born from bad garlic? You almost laugh now, though the truth was darker. The belief that pregnancy proved pleasure turned victims into suspects, their suffering twisted into evidence of consent. Nightmare logic, the kind that lingers like a shadow you can't shake. And yet, even within all that ignorance, there were flickers of real knowledge. Midwives who knew the rhythms of the body whispered remedies that worked better than anything a university-trained doctor could prescribe. Love potions, aphrodisiacs, charms. They feel almost quaint now, but they were deadly serious then. A pinch of rosemary to embolden a shy suitor, a drop of mandrake root to stir a heart that refused to look your way. Some concoctions were harmless rituals, but others walked a thin line between passion and poison. Even so, you can't help admiring the creativity. In a world where marriages were arranged and choices were limited, a girl with no dowry might rely on hope brewed in a copper pot. A boy too timid to speak might tie a name written on bay leaves to his ankle, dancing under the moonlight to win a glance. It was clumsy magic, but it was theirs. Marriage itself was another battlefield, not of love, but of land, titles, and political maneuvering. You remember the young bride of 17, imported like fine wine to seal a treaty, and her 34-year-old husband with thinning hair and more interest in dice than in her. Monogamy was preached, but rarely practiced by the powerful, who collected mistresses like prized horses and expected their wives to smile politely through it all. When women strayed, the punishment was swift and brutal. A convent if they were lucky, drowning in a sack if they weren't. And yet, Some queens and countesses carved their own paths, keeping lovers as boldly as any king, daring history to erase them. Illegitimate children were another unspoken truth tucked under the velvet rugs of noble halls. You think of the baby born downstairs, unwanted yet not unloved, of William the Bastard, who rose to conquer England and wear the insult like armor, of the merchant's son, Thomas, who learned to write contracts with such elegant penmanship that no one cared who his mother had been. Some bastards clawed their way into history. Others vanished into the margins. Historians still argue whether society was harsher than it appears, or if the cracks in the system allowed more freedom than we assume. And then, of course, the plague. The Black Death tore through all pretenses, reducing everyone, nobles, priests, peasants, to the same coughing, desperate humanity. People sought comfort wherever they could find it, sometimes in prayer, sometimes in flesh. A kiss became an act of rebellion, an orgasm, a kind of defiance against the creeping shadow of death. Some towns even relaxed restrictions on brothels, figuring that if the world was ending, at least it should end with warmth and wine. Was it despair? Was it resilience? Maybe both. You think of Elsa, the woman who slept with the same man who buried her sister, not out of lust, but because neither of them wanted to face the night alone. And here you are now, standing in the cathedral's shadow, feeling all these stories settle like dust on your skin. You've walked through their markets, their chambers, their plague-ridden streets. You've heard their whispers and felt their fears. What remains isn't scandal or shock. It's something softer. A reminder that history isn't made only in battlefields or courts, but in quiet moments of longing, in the rustle of a veil, in the press of a hand beneath a table. You take a slow breath. The night feels lighter now, though the bells have long stopped ringing. Ahead lies the final stretch of this journey, a winding down, a soft exhale, where the past fades into the hum of sleep. But before that, let's linger just a moment longer, because some stories don't deserve to be rushed. The air cools as you step out of the cathedral, a hush falling over the cobblestones like the closing of a heavy book. The bells have stopped, leaving behind only the faint echo of their last notes, as if even sound is reluctant to let go. You take a slow breath, the scent of wax and stone still clinging to you, and start to trace your way through the stories that refuse to settle quietly in the past. Every step feels like a walk through memory, soft, deliberate, filled with the weight of what has been whispered and what was never meant to be told. You think of the women first, because their voices linger the longest. The noble wives who smiled through political marriages while keeping the household running like a fortress of silk and strategy. The mistresses who wielded influence from velvet-draped chambers, shaping court fashion and policy with nothing more than a daring neckline or a whispered word. The church scolded them, the chroniclers ignored them, and yet they left a mark as vivid as any knight riding into battle. Were they truly free? Historians still argue whether they were simply surviving within a cage or quietly bending its bars. You suspect the truth is somewhere in between, tangled like threads of embroidery left unfinished. Then there's Tilda, the healer on the edge of the woods, who keeps coming back to you like a song that refuses to fade. Her world was quieter, harsher. She didn't need velvet gowns or political connections. She had herbs, firelight, and knowledge that made the church nervous. Too much independence in a woman was always seen as dangerous. And yet, she stayed, grinding roots, treating wounds, and shrugging off the whispers of witchcraft as though they were just another kind of weather. You wonder if she's still there, crouched by her copper bowl, washing roots while the town gossips about things it will never understand. The stories of desire, those too are carved deep into memory. Velvet and silk, hair unbound, glances that spoke more than words. The codpieces, as ridiculous as they were, still make you smile. A statement of power and bravado so absurd that even now, centuries later, you can't decide if they were the medieval version of self-confidence or pure theater, perhaps both. And the women, with their side-laced bodices and perfumed sleeves, understood the game just as well. Fashion wasn't merely clothing, it was conversation, negotiation, seduction. When the church said, "Cover yourself," people responded by revealing just enough to make it irresistible. You think of the succubi and incubi, those shadowed figures blamed for dreams too vivid to ignore. It's almost comical now, imagining priests poring over confessions and concluding that demons were stealing seed and planting illicit desire. But beneath the absurdity was a deeper truth. People were afraid of themselves. They feared what their own minds conjured in the dark, what their own bodies betrayed under the thin veil of sleep. Even today, historians still debate whether these accounts were metaphors for repression or coping mechanisms for trauma. You suspect they were both, a way to turn desire into something external, something you could fight rather than admit it was part of you. Medicine didn't offer much clarity either. You still remember the illustrations, crude sketches of anatomy that looked more like maps of imagined worlds than actual human bodies. 7 chambers of the womb, monsters born of garlic and bad stars. It would be funny if it weren't so tragic. And yet, among the nonsense, there was a strange kind of respect for pleasure. The belief that female orgasm was necessary for conception is, ironically, more progressive than some myths that came later. It's a bitter kind of progress, used as a weapon to accuse rather than understand. But progress nonetheless. The love potions and charms make you pause, though. There was something heartbreakingly human about them. A girl boiling yarrow and honey, hoping the boy from the next village would notice her. A man wearing rosemary and mace, praying his scent would give him courage. These were not the spells of witches or villains. They were the prayers of people too shy, too desperate, or too trapped by circumstance to simply speak what they felt. You can almost smell the mixture of herbs and hope that must have lingered in those kitchens. Marriage, what a cage, what a performance. The young bride with her vineyards and dowry, standing beside a man who saw her more as a ledger than a lover. And yet, even within that structure, there were sparks. Letters written with trembling hands, poems hidden under pillows. Historians still debate whether medieval couples ever experienced romantic love the way we imagine it. Some letters suggest they did, that they felt the same ache and longing we know now. Others suggest it was all duty and alliance, with love being an afterthought if it came at all. Illegitimate children were proof of all the quiet betrayals, but also of resilience. You think of Thomas, the merchant's son with his perfect penmanship, who learned to make his own place in the world despite the whispers. or William the Bastard, who turned an insult into a crown. They were neither fully acknowledged nor entirely erased, existing in that strange space where society tried to pretend they were invisible, even as their lives shaped history in small but stubborn ways. The plague years still haunt you. You can hear Hal's voice, flat and hollow, declaring that if the world is ending, you might as well find warmth on the way down. There's something both sad and deeply human in that sentiment. The taverns filled with coughing and laughter, the hurried touches, the desperate kisses. It all feels like a defiant reminder that life doesn't stop just because death walks the streets. Historians still argue whether the surge in intimacy during those years was a symptom of panic or a form of resilience. You think it was both, a rebellion against despair. And finally, the cathedral tombs, where death and desire shared the same space. Effigies of knights and wives lying side by side, stone hands clasped in eternal silence. Were they truly in love? Or was that just the story carved to save face? Even the stained glass windows whispered contradictions. Mary Magdalene painted with a tenderness that unsettled the bishops watching from below. You can still see her face, that quiet defiance captured in colored light. As you walk now, past the cathedral's heavy doors and down the narrow streets, the world feels quieter. Not empty, just settled. You carry these stories like a cloak, heavy, warm, filled with the weight of lives long gone, but not forgotten. The wind brushes your cheek, and for a moment, it almost feels like one of those whispers from centuries ago, reminding you that history isn't just dates and battles. It's longing. It's laughter. It's the rustle of a dress, or the faint warmth of a hand on yours in the dark. You pause, taking in the night. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, and a window creaks open, spilling a square of candlelight onto the cobblestones. Life moves on, as it always has. And you, still walking, still listening, are part of that same unbroken thread. The next step in this story is waiting, just a breath away. The night deepens as you move further from the cathedral, its spires now just silhouettes etched against the sky. Your footsteps echo on the cobblestones, soft but deliberate, as though you're walking across the back of history itself. Every corner, every narrow alley, seems to hum with the memory of the lives you've just traced. You feel as if you've been both guest and ghost in this world, watching, listening, gathering the unspoken truths that refuse to be silenced by time. There's a quiet realization that follows you. The Middle Ages were not the gray, joyless stretch of years that textbooks often paint. No, they were vivid, noisy, filled with contradictions so sharp they could cut. There were the women who brewed beer and raised prices with the smug defiance of a queen. The monks who, for all their vows, sometimes carved love poems into the margins of their prayer books. The peasants who, even when the fields were dry and the winters bitter, still found moments to sing, laugh, and hold each other close. It was a world that feared desire and yet celebrated it in hidden corners, as though acknowledging its power only in whispers. You think of the threads that ran through this journey, threads of lust, love, faith, and fear. Desire was never just about the body. It was a language, a rebellion, sometimes even a prayer. When the church warned of demons in the night, people didn't stop dreaming. They simply gave those dreams names like incubus and succubus. When sumptuary laws told women what fabrics to wear, They laced their gowns tighter and let golden curls peek from beneath veils. When medicine declared women cold and wet and men hot and dry, people still reached for each other as though to balance the humors through touch alone. Historians still argue whether these contradictions made the Middle Ages more repressive or strangely liberating. On one hand, there was control. Rules about marriage, rules about inheritance, rules about how much skin could show on a market day. On the other, there were cracks, spaces where people slipped through and made their own rules. You've seen it in the way a servant girl glances at a knight, or how a noble woman might exchange a ribbon with a poet under the watchful eyes of her court. Sometimes, the smallest gestures carried the loudest messages. The memory of the plague years still clings to you like the smell of smoke. The way people reached for warmth as the world burned around them. It wasn't just about pleasure. It was about defiance. A reminder that if death was coming, you'd at least meet it with your lips pressed to someone's hand, your body remembering what it meant to be alive. There's something hauntingly beautiful about that. Even now, the Black Death didn't just kill. It exposed the raw, fragile humanity that lay beneath every sermon and every rule. And then, there's the quiet of the graveyards, the stone effigies lying side by side as if to suggest a peace that might never have existed in life. You can still see the knight and his wife, carved with such care that you almost expect them to open their eyes. Did they love each other? Or was it just an image meant to comfort those who came after? Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that someone cared enough to tell their story, even if it was just in stone. You pause at the edge of a small square where a fountain trickles softly. The air smells of damp earth and the faint sweetness of baked bread lingering from some late-night oven. A cat slips past your feet, glancing at you with the same judgmental stare cats have carried for centuries. You almost laugh. Even in the 14th century, cats were probably thinking, "You people are ridiculous," as they sat watching priests argue about demons, or peasants gossiping over who wore the wrong color stockings. The night here feels alive, not just with memory, but with something more elusive. A sense that history isn't locked behind glass cases or dusty tomes. It's breathing, just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to listen. You realize that's what you've been doing this whole time. Listening. You realize that's what you've been doing this whole time. Listening. Not just to facts or dates, but to the soft hum of human experience, messy and unfiltered. The stories of forbidden love return to you now, lingering like perfume. The young couple who dared to meet under a chapel shadow. The widow who refused to remarry, not because she didn't have offers, but because she wanted to live by her own rules. The lovers who left behind nothing but a folded glove or a poem scrawled on parchment. And somehow, those small traces survived longer than any grand speech. Isn't that always the way? History remembers the quiet rebels as much as the loud conquerors. You think of the radicals, the brethren of the free spirit, and their claim that divine love was found not in denial, but in the body. How shocking that must have been to a world terrified of pleasure, and yet how freeing it must have felt for them. They were hunted, burned, silenced, and yet their ideas, wild, imperfect, defiant, still ripple through time. Historians still debate whether they were dangerous heretics or early visionaries of personal freedom. Maybe they were both. Maybe they were simply tired of being told what to feel. Your footsteps slow as you pass another row of houses. A candle flickers in one window, and you wonder what stories are playing out behind those shutters. A merchant counting coins. A young wife brushing her hair, wondering if her husband's glances at the market girl mean what she thinks they do. A priest kneeling, trying to pray away the thoughts that come too easily in the dark. Human nature hasn't changed much, you think. We still chase the same warmth, the same connection, the same stubborn need to be wanted. The cobblestones are slick from an earlier rain, and the moonlight gleams on them like spilled silver. You step carefully, feeling the weight of this journey settling into your bones. It's not sadness you feel, more like a quiet fullness. You've walked through centuries tonight, and what you've found isn't scandal or shock. It's tenderness. Even when people were bound by rules, fear, or superstition, they still found ways to love, to laugh, to create small rebellions that made life worth living. You pause once more, letting the cool air fill your lungs. The next step, is the last chapter of this winding path, a slow descent into the final moments of the night, where everything you've seen will settle like dust and leave only calm. But for now, you let yourself stand in the quiet, listening to the faint rustle of leaves and the distant toll of a bell. The past is still here, in every breath of wind, in every glint of moonlight on stone. And so are you, walking its edges, just a heartbeat away. The village behind you is now a memory, a faint outline of stone and smoke dissolving into the night. You follow a narrow path that winds between hedgerows, their leaves whispering softly in the breeze. The moon hangs low and pale, casting silver shadows that stretch across the earth like old scars. Every step feels like a gentle unwinding, a release of the stories you've been carrying. It's as though the world itself is exhaling, inviting you to slow down, to listen to the quiet hum beneath the silence. You think back on everything you've seen, the whispered confessions behind monastery walls, the bold laughter in taverns filled with smoke and the smell of roasted meat, the shy glances traded across market stalls, the subtle language of ribbons and gloves. These moments, though small, feel larger than the grand histories of kings and wars. They're the stories that made the world turn quietly, the heartbeat beneath the noise. There's a soft weight to these memories, but it's not heavy. It's comforting. Like an old quilt stitched with 100 tiny pieces of human longing and hope. You recall the widow sitting on a stoop, gossiping about the neighbor who smiled too easily. The healer, Tilda, rinsing roots in her copper bowl, too wise to care what the men in town said about her. The girl who slipped rosemary behind her ear as if daring someone to notice. These aren't just faces, they're echoes. They remind you that the Middle Ages were not just dark and hard, but also filled with small, defiant sparks of life. Historians still argue whether these sparks were rare exceptions or proof of something deeper. A resilience, a refusal to be defined entirely by fear or faith. Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that people kept trying. They kept weaving meaning into their days, even when the world felt fragile and unpredictable. A simple loaf of bread, a stolen kiss, a ribbon tied to a lover's sleeve. These things carried weight, sometimes more than crowns or castles. You keep walking. The path opens onto a gentle hill, and you pause to look back. the fields stretch out like a dark quilt, stitched with the pale threads of moonlight. Somewhere, a dog barks once, twice, then falls silent. You can almost hear the rhythm of daily life settling for the night, the creak of wooden shutters, the sigh of a mother tucking her children into straw beds, the quiet crackle of a fire burning low in the hearth. All these sounds blend into a kind of medieval lullaby, a reminder that even in a time of uncertainty, people sought warmth and belonging. The air smells faintly of damp earth and something sweet. Wild thyme crushed under your boots, perhaps. You breathe deeply, letting it ground you. A sense of peace washes over you as you think about how life, for all its mess and chaos, is always stitched together by moments like these. The bigger events, plagues, wars, famines, may have carved deep grooves into history, but it's the small, ordinary things that filled those grooves with color. You reach the top of the hill and the horizon opens wide. There's no village here, no crowd, no flicker of candlelight, just the sky, vast and starlit, so clear it feels as though you could reach up and brush your fingers against the constellations. The night is still, but it's not empty. It hums with quiet energy, like the world is holding its breath just for you. You remember the lovers who exchanged tokens, a glove, a ribbon, a sleeve, and how those tiny objects outlasted their whispers. You remember the noblewoman who smiled just enough at her rival's husband while wearing green velvet, the fabric puffing like clouds at her sleeves. You remember the stories of bastards born in secret chambers, and how some of them carved new futures from the margins of society. These stories remind you that history is not made solely by those in power. It's written just as much by the small rebellions, the quiet acts of tenderness, the moments when someone chose to love even when the world said they shouldn't. The breeze shifts, and the scent of rain lingers faintly in the air. You let it cool your skin, the sensation grounding you in the present moment. There's something soothing about knowing that people have always felt this same breeze, looked at the same stars, and wondered the same things. Will I be remembered? Did I love enough? Did I live fully, even when life was short and uncertain? You start descending the hill slowly. The fire is low now, its glow barely brushing the stones with a warm orange whisper. You sit quietly, letting everything you've seen drift through your mind like leaves on a slow-moving stream. The laughter in the taverns, the murmured prayers in shadowed chapels, the sharp creak of wagon wheels on dusty roads. Each memory feels softer now, like echoes fading gently into the dark. You take a deep breath, the cool night air settling in your chest like calm water. The stars above seem closer than they did before, scattered across the sky like pieces of old silver. They've watched centuries of stories unfold, wars and weddings, laughter and loss, and they will keep watching long after you close your eyes tonight. Somehow, that thought is comforting. It's a reminder that you're part of a much bigger story, one written slowly, one heartbeat at a time. You think of the faces you've met on this journey, the noblewoman with the pearl necklace glinting like frost, the healer with her hands stained from herbs, quiet and unbothered by gossip, the monk who stumbled on his vows but found something close to love on the road. They're all gone now, long buried under layers of time, yet their lives still glow faintly in the stories they left behind. It's like holding a candle to the dark, small, flickering, but enough to see by. Your mind drifts to simpler things: the feel of rough linen sheets, the smell of fresh bread in the morning, the sound of a distant bell marking the hours. Life in those days was harder, yes, but it was also immediate. Every day was felt in the body, every cold wind, every warm fire, every aching step. Maybe that's why their stories feel so alive now. They lived close to the edge, and in that closeness, they found meaning. Historians still debate whether medieval people were always miserable, or if they found joy in ways we've forgotten. As you sit here, letting their world settle around you like a soft cloak, you think the truth might be somewhere in between. Life was hard, but it was also full of small victories: fresh water, a kind glance, a shared loaf of bread. Perhaps that's what really kept them going, the tiny sparks of humanity that no plague or sermon could extinguish. The night is still. You can almost hear the quiet hum of the earth beneath your feet, steady and eternal. A gentle breeze stirs the trees, and their leaves rustle like whispers, carrying the last fragments of old tales. You let them pass through you without holding on too tightly. This is the moment to let go, to allow the weight of the day and the centuries you've walked through to slide off your shoulders. Your eyelids grow heavy. The world softens, as though the edges of everything have blurred just enough to be comforting. The fire flickers once more, then settles into a quiet glow. You imagine lying down on soft straw, the smell of herbs and old wood around you, and a blanket pulled gently over your shoulders. It's safe here. It's quiet. Nothing more is asked of you. So as you ease into the stillness, remember that history isn't just battles or kings. It's the warmth of a hand in the dark, the hush of a prayer, the quiet laughter of someone who just baked a loaf of bread. Those small human moments are what linger, what endure. And now, as the night settles deep and your breathing slows, those stories fade into a calm, steady silence. Close your eyes. Let the past drift away like a boat on a slow river. The journey is complete, and all that remains is peace. You are safe. You are warm. Sleep comes gently, carrying you to a place where time is soft and every story is just a dream waiting to be told.